Okay, everyone. Good afternoon for the last session of the afternoon in what feels like the coolest room. So there are some bonuses for joining us here. My name is Greg Barrow. I head up WFP, the World Food Programme's London office, and work quite closely with the CDAC Network. And I'm absolutely delighted to have this opportunity this afternoon to talk to the three panelists that we have here. I'll just run through who we have. I know that you've probably read their biographies, and I'm going to give them an opportunity to talk about the specifics of their work as we sort of move through the discussion. But to my left is Yazid Shekem from Suctel Mobile Solutions. At my far right, Justin Richmond from Impel. And just to my right here, Philip Ogola, who is a real live digital humanitarian. And I shook his hand earlier on. He doesn't sort of bite. He's not sort of electric, but he is certainly much more connected than most of us. And he'll tell us a bit about that as we go through here. So I guess there'll be a little bit of overlap in this discussion between what's happening next door, because I think we can't talk about everything you want to know about technology and innovation, but we're too afraid to ask without talking about what are the game-changing pieces of technology that have really sort of brought us to where we are today. And from my perspective, personally, I really think we're at a critical moment. I mean, feels a bit like that moment where the printing press arrived in medieval Europe. There are great opportunities, but there are great threats potentially as well. And another simile that I like to talk about in this context is whether, as humanitarians, we are facing a sort of Arab Spring moment where suddenly all of those millions of people that we are serving are going to turn around and start talking back to us and potentially sweep away the old humanitarian order, and a new system is going to be put in place. And this happens at a fairly critical time for us as organizations, with a World Humanitarian Summit on the horizon and everything that entails. So I think it's an interesting moment to have this discussion. So just to kick things off, we managed to talk beforehand, and I asked each of the panelists what they thought was the most critical piece when it comes to innovation in the environment that they're working in. So Yazid, maybe I'll start off with you, because I think you made a very, very good distinction. I mean, the temptation is always to say the smartphone, but you made a distinction there. So let me just see if I can get this one fired up. That should be live now.
Yes. Thank you, Greg, and hi, everyone. Before the smartphone came, obviously, we all had the simple phones, the feature phones, or even before that, I don't know what you used to call the huge shoebox-sized phones. But ultimately, when mobile phones in general came, into our lives, that's when each of us had a device which doesn't leave us, right? I'm on a panel. I have this one here. I was just chatting with my wife, and I was chatting with my boss as well. So I think the mobile phone in general, not the smartphone, the mobile phone is the one device which everyone carries with them, regardless if you're poor, if you're rich, if you live in I don't know, in Peru, or if you live in Sudan or in Vietnam. Everyone has a smartphone, and we know from the penetration rates that the smartphone, the mobile phone is that piece. It's a piece of clothing, right? It's like a sock, like a piece of underwear. It doesn't leave us. We were carrying it at 95% of the day. So is it smart? Is it feature? Is it satellite? Doesn't matter. It's a phone. It's a communication device which you're carrying with you all the time. And I think that's the game changer. And from there, obviously, we went to different levels of sophistication in terms of smart technology and several and social media, which is ultimately all that, which doesn't work without that device. So the device itself, I think, is what changed our lives, and also in the
and how specifically, maybe you could share with us, how specifically are you using those bog standard phones, mobile phones? I mean, where are you using them, and how are you using them?
It's always it's not embarrassing, but when you say we're a company that started around SMS. SMS is still people look down on it now, especially in the in the developed world, where you say, who uses SMS? I think our company Suctel started in Palestine, in a crisis zone, and the business case for the company was around providing job services, or ways for youths to connect with jobs using SMS. Because until today, there is no data, there's no 3G in Palestine for various reasons. So until now, we have that issue. So it's not gone, right? So so we started with SMS, knowing that it's a gender neutral, it's real time, it's a relatively low cost medium to transfer information and also to collect information for people. So that's how we started. So that's how the company started. But then we use that concept in the humanitarian sector and in the international development sector. But also we're not stuck in time in 2003. We also are looking. We look at social media. We look at smartphones. We look at mobile web. All the things that Facebook and Google are doing. So we are part of the discussion. You can't say no. I only going to focus on SMS, radio, IVR, or voice services. Or it's now what works is multi-channel, multi-platform. We need to be able to gauge and connect people. In the context that they are in. If you're talking to illiterate population, you need to focus on audio services. If you're talking to people who are using mainly feature phones or basic Nokias, SMS most likely, or call them. Don't expect them to call you. Radio, a very important tool, right? So there's a lot of different ways how technology is helping us. And I think we need to go ahead. But to me, my last sentence is, it all goes back to the basics, and especially when we're in a disaster zone, and the people who are most in need will ultimately, you'll see them need, having access to the basics in terms of technologies and also in terms of transport and other services.
Justin, just turning to you, you have a slightly different perspective because you come from the point of view of utilizing those social media platforms that are out there, the Twitters, the Facebook, others. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and how your work with Impel has sort of really helped you become a sort of specialist in that area?
Well, the way I kind of approach this is that, and also so that our panel is a little bit more interesting and we all don't have the same answer, is simply that I assume that some of these technologies on a basic level exist, whether it's a SMS-style phone or a smartphone, some sort of mobile web. But what I think is interesting here is that we understand that there are really two types of data that comes out of these crises that we need to be thinking about. One of them is the programming data, that we see from OCHA, from the clusters where they're talking about where they're doing programmings. But I think a really underutilized and underappreciated source of data are these mobile platforms where Facebook and Twitter, and understanding what are the grievances of these communities, what are the problems that are going on there, how are we really understanding both what are the needs in these communities, how is the international community responding to these, and measuring our own effectiveness, both in the way that we are engaging these communities and helping them to be empowered and a part of this programming, but also how are we being transparent and accountable to them, because I actually categorically disagree when we say that the Typhoon Haiyan was a successful implementation. It was only successful during the first couple months in originally delivering emergency goods. But if you look at the data from month 2 through month 6, it was awful. And if you speak to Filipinos on the ground, they will tell you that the shelter cluster did not respond to them. Livelihoods was almost as bad. Health didn't do a bad job, but health usually responds large. But if we've been tapping into these social networks and really sensing from the communities, we would have known that. So many people are blown away when they find out how dissatisfied the Filipinos were. And we would actually see this in darn near any crisis that we look at. So really, I think this is a way for us to engage the communities that we purport to serve. I mean, are we trying to respond so that our donors give us money? Or are we trying to respond so these communities can get back on their feet and live happy and healthy lives? I mean, I think that's a fundamental question we have to ask ourselves.
Maybe you could just pass the mic to Philip. I think that's a good segue to him. And congratulations to the CDAC Network for picking 3 people who disagree about what really the most important things. Because I know from Philip's perspective, it is is that analytical side of it, how you sort of work with at the back end with this data and almost kind of predict where a disaster is going to happen. And you were giving me some really interesting examples from your work in Kenya around that period when there were so many disturbances around the election. So maybe you could just share a little bit about why that is important and how it all works.
Thanks, Craig. I think to me social media is a mining tool, which most humanitarians really need to invest in. I think most people focus on programs and the response, and they forget the back end. There's a lot of data online, which can actually gather like a situational analysis of the disaster. You get the exact location where it is. With the tools like you get artificial intelligence disaster response, where you actually geolocate a location. Any post on Twitter, any post on Facebook, you actually pick and you get the exact location of where it is. So before you send a response team, before you even send like the first team to respond, you can basically know in terms of the graphical damage, the structural damage, how many people are injured based on the tweets, based on the Facebook posts, because guys are posting imageries, guys are posting videos. It's easy to actually triangulate an area. If it's Geneva, you actually triangulate the whole area and actually pick it up.
Let me ask you on that particular point then, do you think enough organizations know that this information is there and how to use it? And why is that?
I think most agencies only focus on social media for a communication tool on one end, just to publicize the work they're doing. They don't focus on the back end. There's a lot of data, a lot of research, which can actually be a game changer. To me, I think most agencies don't even know about it.
How can we change that? I mean, we can share that information with the group that we have here today, but what are the steps that we have to take to introduce people to that and make them more familiar with the fact that information that...
Okay, to me, I think most agencies think social media just as a communication tool. To me, it's a multi-pronged tool in terms of you need to have a monitoring team just to monitor what's being said about your brand, about your projects, because like he said, you can assume your project is doing well, but the conversation online can be very negative. How many people do that? There are tools which monitor sentiment analysis online. You can actually get to know your brand, who is talking about you, what are they saying, where are they saying from, which age they're. It's basically, you can actually get everything online. I can give various examples in Kenya. During the Westgate, it was very easy to actually get to know the pulse of the ground, what the need was on the ground based on the tweets. Because there are tools which can actually segment the tweets based on the need. If somebody is looking for a missing person, the tool can actually put them in buckets based on the missing person, based on the report. Is it a crime report? Is it what? So to me, I'm like, there needs to be more of training, more of empowerment to communication teams, just not only to use it as a communication tool, but more of an information gathering tool.
Justin, maybe if I could just turn back to you, just moving this discussion on a little bit. I mean, I think one of the issues that has been highlighted is a certain amount of anxiety and perhaps a feeling that the information we're dealing with is not trustworthy enough. But we haven't really seen organizations working in this sector embrace it to the extent that they should. And when we spoke, you felt that really that people were too cautious about adopting new technology. I think you said there was almost a sort of Luddite tendency that we want to stick to what we know, and we feel suspicious about this new information that is out there.
This is a really tricky conversation because when we start talking about technology, data and the right data reveals all of the scars and nicks and scratches in the programming that exists. And I fundamentally believe that there are some organizations that don't want a real bright light to be shown on their programming. However, that's kind of the pessimist side. I do think there are a lot of organizations that want to learn more about the programming that they're doing. And I think the only way that you can do this is to triangulate your position in a given community, in a given sector, and in a given crisis through this type of data mining that you're talking about, both using social media as a communication platform out and back, looking at the UN OCHA data that OCHA's doing a lot better job hosting online, looking at your own programming data and seeing exactly where you lie. The problem is some groups don't, well, There's a variety of issues. Some groups don't have the leadership that empowers people to use and experiment with this, and I think that is bad. The reason being, if we can take just a few steps forward in understanding our own processes and how to get information and how to receive that information better, that's positive. If we're serving communities better, that, in the cost here that we're talking isn't large. I mean, we're in terms of Facebook, in terms of Twitter, that's not a high expense. But I think people are more concerned with managing their brand, managing exactly what their outward performance is. And I don't think that's a good enough reason. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here.
Still one-way communication rather than this dialogue.
I don't see dialogue happening hardly at all. Well, I don't see a dialogue happening with large international organizations. I have seen it happen with some local Filipino organizations, but they had already set up those networks. People were already going onto their Facebook pages and saying, hey, we need help with livelihoods out here. Our coconut groves have been destroyed. What are we going to do? It takes 7 years to grow a coconut tree. They're like, okay, well, let's talk about this. And we know this other group operating up in Manila. Maybe we can bring them down. But for these organizations to kind of parachute into Tacloban or into Ormoc City, and they try to do this work in the Philippines, sorry about that, when they parachute in, they don't have networks set up. So I think we have to be changing this dynamic of organizations working with local groups and having much more symbiosis than this, than I think the model that has existed up to this point. I mean, this is really all about, if we believe in connectivity, that connectivity isn't linear, it's actually more of a hub and spoke model where we're reaching out into these communities, reaching to these other organizations, and allowing local organizations, local networks to teach us how we need to operate in these communities, what technologies are important, when do we need to be using SMS versus mobile web or whatever. I think it's these local nodes that will help us the most.
Yazid, what can we do to build more confidence? What can we do to get all of these agencies out there doing more of this stuff? What's it going to take?
I think ultimately it's a demand-driven model. It's the people, the beneficiaries, the communities will tell us what they need, and they will use the tools that they're most comfortable with. So there's talk about drones now and wearables and all that. It's not going to work. If that community is comfortable using a certain way of communication, then we should actually embrace that and not impose communication a way. So if for example, international humanitarian international organization X comes up with a concept, we're going to use Facebook now globally in all our projects, and then they go everywhere and start coming up with these standard models and using Facebook and rolling those out. And there's not going to be any feedback. Why? Because it's a top-down approach. It's not a demand-driven approach. And I think that's part of, if people understand this is the natural way I communicate with my family, with the government, and also with humanitarian organizations, then I'm going to be happy also to share information, about my needs. However, I think now, I'm living in a country now, which is surrounded by Arab Spring results. So I can tell you, Twitter penetration less than 10%, Facebook 100%. There's an overkill of information on Facebook, overkill, and it's mainly negative. And because there's so many things, so many people, everyone has access to Facebook. So there's been a negative trend. Actually, people don't trust Facebook, specifically Facebook, as a source of information for news and other things. Also now, with the bad local situations in the countries, you have the governments controlling Facebook. Most Arab countries now have, Tunisia just last week announced a state of emergency. Jordan not, but they know exactly what's going on. Egypt, everyone.
What does that mean when they take control of Facebook? What happens?
They don't take, which means you can get arrested for liking a page which might be affiliated to organization Y. So anything you do is being controlled. There are also, there's pages and organizations popping up which are actually, set up by certain groups or intelligence agencies in order to, get information from you. So the level of trust at this point, because there's such an overkill of information, is very hard to attain. So I don't know, maybe it's just me. I switched off Facebook on my phone a month ago because I just can't see it anymore. It's just too much. And I think more and more people are going to look at it that way. I'm going to switch off that stuff because there's just so much information coming and the quality is very low and it doesn't really help me in my day-to-day life. So I might just go back to the basics.
This is another of the barriers that has been highlighted. You called it overkill of information, too much information. You know, what do you do, Philip, with this avalanche of information that you can mine from these very rich veins on social media?
I'll give you an example. During the Westgate, there were over 50 million tweets.
The terrorist attack in Nairobi.
There were over 50 million tweets. That was on the day of the attack. So there's a tool which can actually make your work easier. It just aggregates, picks from the clutter, and makes sense to you. This is a need in terms of response. This is a hoax. You can even do cross verification based on the tweets. Let's say if Greg has done a tweet, the tool can actually verify your location where you are and if it really happened. So to me, there are tools which can actually make sense of that data. From the clutter, you can actually classify them and make sense of what it is. So to me, I think big data is actually the future of actually changing the way we respond.
You come from a perspective where you really understand that, you get that, you work in that area. Justin, when we were talking, you said that you're frustrated with the view that you see of so many organizations who are just walking around with massive amounts of information and not using it.
So, yeah, I mean, I would probably push back on this a little bit because there's a lot of data and most of it is pretty bad. And the problem is aggregating bad data just means you have an aggregation of a lot of bad data. It doesn't tell you anything useful. And so what I really try to get people to think about is what I like to call the micro data revolution, right? I just spent the last 2 years at a big data firm, one of the biggest data firms in the world. And the one thing I learned is that most organizations really aren't counting the right things. They're not looking at the right data. And until we really fix the way that we look at these communities and how they function, more observable data, then we can verify with the social media data, we're really not iterating towards the right types of solutions. So what I would argue is that there are some fantastic tools that exist. Some of them are free. The best ones tend to be expensive because there's a lot of engineering that went into them. But almost all organizations I've worked with aren't looking at the right data nodes, and you can break that down by clusters specifically. You know, is the health cluster actually looking at the local hospitals and the local health clinics? How many people are being seen? What are they being seen for? Where did they come from? And how is the service? You know, epidemiological information where I've seen where you can tease out from one health clinic where the malnutrition is, where the waterborne illness is, and where they're fighting over water because people are coming in with machetes. And yet we are still talking about how many medicines we dropped off there, how much money we spent, how many doctors we trained. Until we get to the micro data, you know, I don't even want to have a conversation about aggregating what people are reporting. It honestly sometimes distracts, I think, from where we actually need to be talking. How do we serve these communities? How are we accountable to what we're delivering?
Can you get down to the microdata, Philip? Is that something? I mean, you know, can you, in your work with the Kenyan Red Cross, you know, were you mining it that deeply? And how was that information received within the organization, and was it really acted upon? And when it was acted upon, what was the impact?
The impact was actually instantaneous. For example, let's say the tweets or posts based on missing person, it was easily, quickly to actually verify and communicate with the person. So what the tool did, did put the post based on clusters. So if it's a query based on missing person, it was very quickly to link it with the search and rescue team. So it was, if it's a police security threat, it was quickly escalated with the police. So to me, it was, I can say it, but it needs a lot of teamwork. Because there's a lot of, you can imagine mining through 1 million tweets because the stream was just coming like. You need to have the tools in place, because what we did on that day, we set up like emergency response center where we had like screen set up so we could easily mine all this information. So to me, I think it's very, very, very possible to mine through the clutter and get the micro data, but it needs a big team and a lot of dedication.
Let me just Open it up to the floor, and I want to bring Mike in just here briefly, because we had a conversation which I think sort of takes us off in another interesting direction, which is that the temptation here is to look at new technology and look at what's available, jump on that, and go for that in its entirety. But maybe we should be seeing how it integrates with, for want of a better term, the more traditional media, the broadcast media, newspapers. We could even go as far as to say we include community leaders in the way that they sort of do mini broadcasts to their communities. I mean, what's your experience, Mike, in terms of that integration? Do you feel threatened by all of this, or do you see an opportunity here? Sorry.
Mike Adams with First Response Radio. Thanks, Greg, for adding a radio perspective here. I think every tool fits somewhere. And so I would never say we shouldn't use that tool, I don't like that tool, you should all use my tool. Every tool works somewhere well and does something best. And someone almost said it, but I'll just make it more clear that the high connectivity smartphone networky stuff is great for the early warning phase. The typhoon is coming, the typhoon is coming, seek shelter, seek shelter. The typhoon hits, this network goes down. So then we have to be prepared that that tool is not going to work in the emergency phase in the first recovery days. I was in the Philippines, and it was 2 weeks waiting for the 3G network. Voice was back, texting was back. We waited 2 weeks for 3G for other things to come back. So every tool has its place, and in radio, we're talking to the community over our on-air FM radio broadcast, but we need them to talk back to us. So we will use whatever technology works. We will stick generally, because we're there in the emergency phase, we'll stick with the rugged ones that work. Give us voice calls or SMS texting. We'll use those. And if none of those work, if none of those are working, we send our journalists out with the digital audio recorders into the field to make sure that we get the voice of the community, or invite the community to come in to the station. But we have to get voices of the communities. We'll use whatever technology works, and so we'll be doing other technologies with radio to make sure we're hearing back from, because it's feedback. Feedback drives our radio programming. When people say we're really unhappy with shelter, that drives our radio programming to try to find more answers about shelter topics.
But when communication systems are back up and running, are you tweeting and putting stuff on Facebook while you're broadcasting? If somebody walks into your studio, says something really interesting and really important and useful, will you take a picture of them and tweet a quote from them? Is that something you do, so you're kind of aligning all of these things at the same time?
I think we could be doing more of that in the later stages. First Response Radio mostly operates in the emergency phase, so oftentimes we just don't have access to that. But Typhoon Haiyan, our team was there 6 weeks. 3G came back after 2 weeks. I think I was out of country, but I think our Filipino team was using Facebook as a way to connect. The people were doing song requests over Facebook. We're kind of socially reconnecting with our staff and everything, and using that forum. So I'd say we need to use what works, and when technology is back up and we have access to it, we should be using that to create the second half of the two-way communication.
Maybe if I could just grab the mic back off. Mike, you were talking about an example earlier on where you've seen a sort of integration between cutting-edge social media and traditional media of the kind that Mike's working in, radio, etc. Could you just tell us a little bit more about how you see that working?
No, I think the example Mike was talking about how do you engage communities, how do you use radio, for example, as a way to send out information, but also to capture information. So we've set up SMS-based feedback services with Internews and with other organizations in Gaza and in Kenya and so on, basically to give access to people who are not connected, who have specific needs. And then there's the radio, there's the organization that's operating the radio, but then also there's aid agencies that are connected to that service who are taking the information and then acting upon it. We also have currently a service in actually one of the Syria hasn't come up as if it's not existent here in this discussion, but you know, biggest refugee flow in the last 2 years, I think, if not worldwide. So we have a service also with one of the organizations for Syrian refugees in Turkey who are seeking legal advice. But okay, this is post-conflict. This is not while it's happening. These people have already left their homes. They're in a different countries, in a country, but they want to get access to information, to access to legal advice. So we, you know, there's a radio service which is up and running, and people can actually, they receive information about their rights. They're aware of what they can do, what they can ask for, where to direct their grievances, and then they can, you know, communicate their needs to aid agencies or to legal support firms who will be able to, you know, to support them and take that up. So I think it's a linkage. Always, you always need that medium which people gets to the people, you know, en masse, you know, or, you know, at scale. So radio in many cases is that, SMS in many cases, TV not so much. You know, smartphones, apps, etc. Post-conflict, we really have not found that way, and have not seen how those can actually be implemented directly with the communities. Yes, in some cases, you know, you can work with aid agencies and provide them with apps, or, you know, like offline apps for data collection, for M&E purposes, to go out to the field when, you know, if they want to capture how many, coconut trees have fallen down. So you go out and you have a device where you enter all your data, and that's synchronized with a database, which is great. But in terms of the end users, not so sure, especially the app discussion, not so sure how that applies. You can do surveys and some back and forth, but I haven't seen the revolution there. For us, it still always goes back to a very traditional method, being radio, for example, and then connect that to that SMS, connect to that the various other technologies.
Can I just ask you a follow-up?
Go ahead, go ahead.
So you live in Jordan, is that right? So some people in this network have said Syrian refugees who are in Jordan, in camps in Jordan, won't listen to radio. When we proposed having refugee radio in some of these camps in Jordan, people said they don't listen to radio, they only watch satellite TV. And to me, this didn't make any sense, and I didn't know where this came from. But as soon as one person said it, everyone else said it as if it was a fact. And I hear you saying something else. I want you to specifically comment. Would people listen to interact with, use radio for building community within a refugee camp, with the community, with the Syrian IDPs, relate to that or not?
I think there's a clear difference in terms of what the content is, right? I mean, the satellite channels are news channels, entertainment channels, and there's no humanitarian TV channel I know of, at least in the Middle East. So I think, you know, radio, if the content is right, people will listen to it. If it connects to what they need, people will listen to it. TV is, yes, people watch a lot of TV, and they're on Facebook all the time. And, you know, the camps in Jordan, they're nicely connected, and they all have their, you know, satellite dishes on their tents. But they don't get any information that's relevant to them, that's local, that's context driven, right? So it's very general news driven. It's got nothing to do with the situation of Syrian refugees specifically in Jordan or in the, you know, Lebanon or Turkey or Iraq. So I mean, I think there is potential. Are there other challenges? Absolutely. I mean, that's another story. But, you know, probably demand would be there.
Justin, you got a point to make, and then we'll open up for some questions from the floor.
Really quick, I actually want to kind of draw down on the apps point that you just made. One of the biggest problems that I have seen in coming out of the big data field is that, you know, I run into people that are like, oh, we have an app for that. The problem is nobody's apps are connected with their rear-end databases, with their back-end databases, and with all the other tools that they're using. And so in my former organization, it wasn't about aggregating data, it was about integrating data in you know, unstructured data, which is your PDF report, your report from the field, a news report. And then with all your structured databases, which could be coming out of your programming, it could be it could be some sort of monitoring and evaluation database that you have. And the problem is, you don't want to have all these separate tools that do their own special snowflake things. You have to have something. You have to have tools that will integrate these data streams together, because you get something from qualitative data, you get something from quantitative data, you get something from perception data. We really have to come at this much more holistically. And number one, you know, granted, the anecdotal stuff, the qualitative stuff is easier, and we've all made kind of careers on basing all of our stuff anecdotally. But I don't think any of us, if we've been working in this sector for a long time, feel like we have remotely scratched the surface on what is really important. What are we gathering? How are we measuring our own effectiveness? And how are we delivering this? And that really boils down to matching up our open development kits on our Android phones with our backend databases, and then being able to share that out to the broader community, because I think we need to be more transparent. I think I want you all at some point to look at my data and say, you know what, you got it wrong here, and this is why. Because that means I learn, and that means you're able to raise our own understanding of these really difficult problems, and then we serve the communities better. And at the end of the day, it all goes back to the community. I mean, that's why we're talking about CWC. How do we engage these communities and serve them better? So that's my big plug. Just because someone says that they can write an app for something doesn't mean you should use it, even if it's free. Let's figure out how to make our data much more integrated and much more understandable for the broader community. That's my plug.
Okay. So everything you ever wanted to ask about technical innovation in the humanitarian sector, but you were afraid to ask, now is your opportunity. Let's start over here.
Thank you very much so far, very interesting. A couple of observations. One, and this is actually an old quote by Paul Curian, but I've adapted it. Getting information from social media is like trying to drink water from a fire hose. I only really understand something weeks after it's really happened, when I sit down at night, read The Economist, or even the Erin articles, So I think there's a real risk that we have a thin intelligence happening, because we take it from the soundbite. And I've seen a deterioration in the analysis or the social scientist skills in the field through some organisations, because we're jumping to the app, to their technology as a solution. Before this, 10 years ago, we would do the old-fashioned problem tree. What are we trying to solve? We'd be much less arrogant in the sense of our role in the humanitarian response is so small compared to the people-to-people, community-to-community aspect of it. So I think we really need to come back when we talk about technology to say is, where is the niche added value for us in a response? Go back to basics and say, what problem are we trying to solve? The big data is useful to get you thinking about questions. It will never solve the problem unless you go back and look at the microdata and do a proper study and think about the problem. And last but not least, at the very end of this, you start thinking about what tools and assets do I have at my disposal to solve the problem? And finally, if we can teach people who come into the humanitarian world to use Excel, right? Or how to schedule a meeting using email clients, we'll improve the productivity and efficiency of the humanitarian sector tenfold. Thank you.
As baby steps. Philip, let me just put that to you, because that seems to be a question that's directed to you. What is the real value of this information? And is it, when in your experience, in your practical experience, did it work best when you cross-referenced it with whatever else you had there and the resources you had at hand to actually respond to it? I mean, just talk us through that side of things with reference to that particular question.
I think I need to make something clear. Social media alone is not a solution. Most people think they can only use social media entirely. No. You have to use the traditional existing ways. Social media only complements what you do and only cross-verifies. So social media to me is actually a verification tool. It gives you more insight, something which you can't have by the face value. In case of a disaster, social media gives you that added value in terms of the exact location where it is and what is the need. It gives you the pulse on the ground before you actually send a team out. So to me, don't use social media alone without using your existing ways of working. It only complements what you are doing. To answer your question in terms of the drinking water from it's like drinking water from a fire hose. To me, as a humanitarian, you need to know your key words. Like what he said, you need to cluster your keywords. So you actually search social media based on clusters. So out of that, you actually make sense of that. because it's easy for you to track and monitor sentiment analysis. What's the tone on the ground? What is the mood? What are people saying? Based on that, it's easy now to, with the microdata, to make an informative analysis of what you are doing. Then you can actually compare it with your reports. Is it facts on the ground? Is it because maybe your monitoring team can say that it's a success on the ground and the mood online is negative. So to me, it's actually how do you verify what you are doing on the ground? Is it a success? Is it? Yep.
Yazid, for you, what is the added value? I mean, isn't social media information just the same old chatter just coming through different channels?
No, I don't think so. Because I think we, in many examples where people use our solutions, which are SMS based or audio based, so we get those for initial high level feedback from the communities. But to go dig deeper, it's face to face. You need to sit down. You have to have discussions. You need to have it's a bigger investment and to get quality data. So I think yes, it makes sense to use social media data for high-level information, for mapping, for high-level sentiment analysis, but not as a decision-making tool. And to say I'm going to send all my aid into this direction or that direction, because again, social media is yes, if you're talking about a country which is well connected. It's this digital gap, right? The people who are connected, they have better access. They're better, they're more literate. They're more eloquent in putting down their requests and their needs. And if they're the loudest, if you shout the loudest, people will look at you, right? And that's not where we want to get. We want to get to the last person who is really disconnected physically and technologically and everything. And that person, I don't know how likely it is you'll get to that person using Twitter or social media. So social media, yes, great tool. But like you said, Philip, complements all the other work you can. It does not replace, the manual work which we need to do, which you cannot replace technologies with, humans with technologies. It doesn't work.
I'll give you an example in Kenya. During the elections, there were pockets of flares where people are intertribal fightings and the bulk of the tweets, Facebook posts actually came in and said this group is actually, they want to attack another tribe. And based on those tweets, police were sent and actually there was peace. So to me, I think it's need basis. And I think it's sector by sector can actually use social media, not like bulk. To me, I think in terms of emergency response, it really works well because you can get a tweet or a post, then you say that this is not weighty, then people die. So to me, I think it's need as per need basis.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very contextual. I mean, it worked in that situation, but we got to do what we try hard not to do everywhere, which is to apply the same solution in every country. Because, I mean, I can see how that Kenya example worked, but I can also see how it's not going to work elsewhere. Did you want to make a point on this, Justin, or should we bring another question?
No,
yeah.
No, I totally agree on that.
Okay. There was somebody at the back who had a question. If you could just say who you are and which organisation you represent.
My question, I completely agree on the needs analysis side, that with the level of information that we have available, we can do an enormous amount of secondary data analysis before we even start doing needs assessment. My question is more about when we're in the middle of a response, and Gaz is a perfect example of this, where really we should be communicating almost at an individual level with the technology that's available. Are we adapted as a system to meet those needs? Because what strikes me is the technology in terms of information and communication is there. But I wonder as a system, as a humanitarian system, if we're set up to respond to those things and to adapt our response to that feedback.
To respond to individuals.
Well, it's not even individuals, it's understanding that, water and food parcels weren't the solution, but the issues of human rights and protection. Are we fast enough, nimble enough to be able to switch our response and adapt what we're doing to what we're doing? And the sense I have is that as a system, we're too heavy and too large and too bulky and really not nimble enough to be able to adapt to what we're hearing from those families in Gaza. Because we can hear the messages, we have the technology. And when I was in Palestine a month ago, feedback I have is accountability to affected populations has been very strong. are not able to adapt their responses to this.
Do you want to respond to that, Yazid, as it's an area that you've worked in?
No, I mean, fully agree, and I think it's a case to case. In some cases, you've had organizations which are more lean and dynamic, able to respond. Others have been very slow to respond. In the specific case of Gaza, most of our work has been with UN organizations, and we've had different levels of success in terms of how you react to feedback that's coming from the communities. I think where we have seen, I think. The initial benefit of technology in places like Gaza is okay. You set up a way to inform people of there's something happening in your area. Watch out. We have a project with UNESCO. Safer schools. So if there's an imminent attack or something that's happening, there's communication networks to warn children and their parents and teachers and employees not to come to that. But that's one way information. But capturing information and responding to that, it's a big challenge. I think, yes, the humanitarian sector absolutely needs to become much more leaner and dynamic, and also be more demand focused versus supply focused. To say, to understand more, to understand what do people need, and then accordingly provide, and not provide in a pre-calculated manner. And I think that's just this leveraging supply against demand. It's very hard. But it's if someone can develop this Uber for the humanitarian sector, where automatically people who want to do have a need will be able to share that, and then the closest supplier will be there. Great, but that requires a lot of work, and I'm not able to answer that question. But I fully share that there's challenges around that.
Just quickly, one point. I mean, I suppose part of the value of new technology is that we are going to get more feedback, or we're going to just get told. And that is going to force us to change the way that we do our business.
Yeah. So I actually think there's a very straightforward way to get at what you're talking about. I think a lot of us have identified those very similar problems. The system is categorically not made to be adaptable, partly because everything is stovepipe into their various clusters. And I think this makes the case for having much broader cross-sectoral collaboration and cross-sectoral, specifically of that data. Not just getting together in cluster meetings and talking, but getting cross-sectoral meetings where people are able to see, how I can show you data from the Philippines where it was one cluster that was hurting other clusters. Specifically where. This isn't like child protection, human rights, but we saw where, because the shelter cluster had broken down so much, people were still living in tents and tarps 2-3 months after the typhoon came through, that we saw a large number of animal bites and even cases of rabies in these communities. And it wasn't because people in the shelter cluster were raising their hands like, man, we kind of screwed this up. It was because the health clinics were saying, we need rabies vaccinations, we need the antibiotics, we need to be able to do a lot more wound care. People were asking, well, why are we having all these animal bites? And then everybody looked over at the shelter cluster and said, wait a minute, why are they still living out of doors? Why are they still living in tents? And so I think when we get to that cross-sectoral data sharing, and there are numerous tools, I thought actually, what we used in the Philippines more broadly as a community was the UN OCHA kind of Google Drive Excel spreadsheet, which was lots of unstructured paragraphs in rows and columns, which as a data guy, that just makes me cry. But that's better than usual, but we have to do better. And I think it really is on the large donor organizations to sponsor that. For the little groups that want to do this type of data sharing, that can show you the breakdowns between governance, child protection, security. That's where we have to be, where we're sharing these analyses. We're getting back to these problem trees and decision trees. That's where we have to be. We're a long way from it, but I don't think until we work together as a community to collaborate cross-sectorally, we're going to get there.
There was another question here at the front. Are we able to go beyond 6 o'clock here? We started late, so I'll take you first, and then the lady just behind you. Maybe
Lois
2 questions. We'll take yours and then the other one.
Okay. I'm Lois from ActionAid International. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm just wondering, as an organisation, we're trying to build up accountability and listening to communities and all that kind of thing. And we've been talking for years, obviously, as a sector about, okay, how do we manage expectations if somebody says we need X, Y, Z in my community? How do we look at trustworthy sources? How do we make sure we've got the capacity as a federation to respond to whatever problems are coming up or whatever communities are asking us. To move on a step forward as a practical step, do you have any suggestions? I think an ideal solution would be, if we had every country office, there was a focal person who had the skills and the time to analyse what's happening in social media, particularly where smartphone usage or whatever is very high. But what can we actually do when you've got very limited resources, you've got stretched comms people who are probably also an M&E officer and something else? What can we practically do so that resources don't just sit in a London hub or a Nairobi hub, where we have many country officers and lots of disaster responses, as a practical step to move one step closer towards actually using social media as a means for people to contact us, and also us to triangulate the data, like you said, because I don't think, other than people looking at pictures in the first few hours whilst our teams are on the way, I don't think we use it to inform a response. And we would presume that the most affected people, the most vulnerable and marginalised people would not be on social media, so we kind of box it straight away. So any suggestions would be great.
Take that question, but we'll also take a question from the lady behind you as well. And then
I think it partly links. I'm Anne, I work for Plan UK. I suppose that's the same question, that most agencies will work with the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable wouldn't have access to a lot of these things, and certainly social media will only flag up the more able, more proactive people anyway. So there were two things I was wondering. I was hoping to hear more about what about in the countries where there are disasters and maybe there's rubbish mobile network, there's no internet connection, even as NGOs we struggle to get those facilities. Like, has there been thinking about how this can be spread to where there is the greatest vulnerability? And also, is there any work, are any of you able to do any work about convincing donors to fund some of this? Because if we put some of these things in proposals, we'd never get the funding for it. So it's really about how can we use technology to access the most vulnerable, and how can we fund it, bearing in mind that the most vulnerable are probably have the highest degree of poverty.
I think there's three questions there in total. Lois was saying, how do we convince the human resources people, I guess, within our own organisations to extend the support, the finances, the resources that are needed to get the specialists out there beyond the hubs to do this. Your question was, does it really work amongst the really vulnerable in the isolated, out-of-the-way places, and will donors respond in kind and support it? I mean, Philip, do you want to take those three to begin with, and particularly referencing your experience in Kenya, where one would assume that there's a sizable part of the population that doesn't have this kind of access that's going to give them the opportunity to share this kind of information?
I think to answer your question, I think social media once gives you a platform to report back to your donor real time on what they're funding you for. So it gives you a platform to actually do human interest stories and actually capture the moment. Because social media, if used well, you can capture the emotion and even get more donors. So me, I'm looking at first, before you actually get a team, the staff have to be trained. I think most humanitarian agencies forget that they do stories about the vulnerable beneficiaries and forget they're also part of the stories. So you can also be part of the stories, talk about your challenges, talk about your successes, be part of that, the continuing of the story. It makes more sense if I see Greg being part of the story, like now I'm responding to Nepal, I'm responding to that. So to me, I'm like, how is the team also becoming part of the social media communicating, like the face of the face of giving that human face to the communication. And then I'm looking at, setting so many teams in globally will be quite costly. There are tools you can actually use, and you can actually geolocate an area, which can actually give you alerts. If it's Nairobi, you can geolocate Nairobi, and it will give you anything tweeted about Plan UK, any project about Plan, you can actually be flagged direct to your email, as it tweeted, as it posted on web or blogged. So to me, I think it can be, before you get a team, you can start getting those alerts to your mail, any tweet, any blog, which can actually keep you more informed. And then I'll give you an example. In Kenya, there's the places where there's no like 3G connectivity, or the internet connectivity is below, it's non-existent. But people use SMS. There's something called Twitter for SMS, where you can you can Twitter as an SMS. And it's quite popular in Kenya in those remote areas. People have those traditional low-end phones, but they can still tweet as an SMS, and it comes as a tweet on the other end. And it's for free. So in Kenya, it's quite popular. Guys actually tweeting via SMS, and I think that's also another way to go. To me, at Red Cross, how it worked is when you communicate real time, and social media is like an added value to what you're doing. When you capture stories real time, I can give examples of Red Cross. Okay, I'll speak for Red Cross since I used to work there. When you used to do live event updates, it captured the emotions of donors or emotions of government, and the key mandate of the organization was actually known. So to me is, if you don't have the expertise, you can actually get volunteers online. Nowadays, people on social media, you can get guys who are passionate about your brand, who can be feeding you information, and it's easy you can get volunteers and even interns. Like now for the refugee community, there are people who actually send in stories every day, so it's easy to actually get a team in place. Yeah.
Yazid, when we spoke a few weeks ago, you talked about sort of the lack of penetration of the networks in some areas. How do you overcome that challenge in the really remote places?
You need hardware usually to overcome these challenges, and there are organizations who are specialized on that. I mean, there's, Ericsson is doing a lot of initiatives now on providing mobile network or as data or Wi-Fi or at least GSM spots. Other organizations also are, there's Telecoms Sans Frontières, same thing. If something happens, they go in and they set up emergency telecommunications. Now, we don't touch that because that's more of a hardware situation where if we're happy, if there's a network available, then we will connect to that. But we are not able to set up our own network. But there's more and more initiatives, even private, and more private sector organizations coming up, not just these Google balloons, which everyone's talking about, but also very simple devices where you can, I think Vodafone as well has like these mobile boxes which you can just set up, and then it creates like an emergency signal for people to which they can connect to. So it's there. I think, but you're right. It's very hard to build that into a proposal. Usually you're dependent on either the government or mobile operators or organizations like the ETC or others to come in and set these things up, and then we work with that. So and see what's available and then connect to that. But I think generally there is a struggle around funding. And sorry, maybe I'm deviating, but there's a definite struggle about funding and getting the message over to donors around that. We have also, especially we work in the development sector in general. Humanitarian response is the most difficult one to actually obtain funding. If you have a great concept, we're partnering with Plan, or we're partnering with Relief or with Save the Children, and we have a great idea, and we want to go to someone to say, listen, we want this. We have this situation on the ground here in Jordan, right? And we'd like to, can you fund us? It's not a priority. Technology is not. We're focused now on food deliveries. We don't have enough money to. But ultimately, technology is a basic human it's a need now, right? You can't. People need technology, need communication in order to survive, and that's how it is. But we still need to do that kind of work with the donors to convince them that. To give us the money to develop good systems for that.
Justin, did you just want to respond particularly on those issues relating to how one gets your own office up to speed and the donor perspective?
Sure. These are really good questions, and I'll tell you, I think it's a local community. To start with you, it's a local community that has to drive what technologies you're using. Kind of goes back to what you said earlier, Mike. At the end of the day, I've seen basic radio used with SMS texting work brilliantly in some of the deepest, darkest, most dangerous areas of the world. And if that's what works, and that's how the community, if that's the mode that the community trusts, then I think I mean, they're the ones who are receiving these benefits. They're the ones who we have to be communicating with. So, I mean, I think we have to be kind of humble in our own approach and not necessarily postulate solutions to problems that we don't fundamentally understand. Then going back to your question, I actually think in the way that I approach this is we have to work towards incentives, and I think the donor community actually needs to be incentivizing those groups that work with data, because I think that we're quickly approaching an age when the small nonprofits start challenging these broader methodologies and say, look, you know, we can't actually get at this data. We can show you why we want to do this programming, and it takes this technology, and not necessarily the technology to report it, but having donor organizations being the ones empowering groups and saying, look, if you're asking us for $200,000, it is enough for us to ask you for an Excel spreadsheet that actually tells us where your programs are going with a latitude and longitude. That is not too much to ask. Any organization that wants to throw a bunch of money at me, I'm going to jump through a few hoops. And I think donor organizations themselves don't realize the power that they have here, because on some level, they should be accountable to the people that are giving them money, but on another level, accountable to the communities that they want to serve. And if that's the case, just asking people to give cute anecdotes and pictures of little kids with backpacks cannot work in the 21st century. I mean, we have to demand a higher standard, both within our community, from donors, and ourselves. So, you know, I mean, I'm pretty aggressive in the way that I approach this, because the solutions are there. And it's really in empowering those organizations, capturing those best practices and those case studies, and then pushing them out to the broader community and saying, it's not enough, like a PDF isn't enough anymore. It's not. And these communities are suffering because we're allowing these really poor standards to be maintained. So,
just to add on that, I think most agencies don't tell their stories. There's a lot happening, but it's just done. Like now, if I ask you what you've done last year, you'll give me a whole bunch of files of reports and reports. I think we don't actualize those reports into humanity stories. We just do reports for donors, but now in terms of doing humanity stories for the public view, having an interactive emotional story, we don't do that.
Film and, you know, real engagement.
But I don't think they're data-based. I think it's a lot of anecdotes. I don't think a lot of people are actually showing from a baseline how their programming was targeting certain issues within the community and how it improved. And that's the only thing that I would put.
That's how we report. That is a log frame and a report.
Yes.
That is how you do that. And then to the supporters, you would do, you would do the stories, the real showing, translating that into real human stories. But I mean, I agree, maybe not everybody does that, but I would say, lots of organisations do that as a matter of course, right? In action, I do agree. Yeah. But data gathering has to get better then.
Yeah, I think this brings me back to a conversation that I had with Justin earlier, which is the sort of output and outcome sort of distinction. You know I work for an organisation that says it feeds sort of in excess of 80 million people every year. Great, fantastic. We pat ourselves on the back about that. But what did it actually achieve? What was the actual outcome of it? And I think the outcome side of it is the area I'm happy to say that we're weak on that and we need to get better at it, but I think other organizations need to as well, and I think that's the point that you're trying to make here.
We should be so far beyond outputs. But outcomes I don't see people really talking about, because quite frankly it's inconvenient. If the larger donor community saw how few outcomes can really be shown, I mean, the $500 million with Haiti, with the American Red Cross is a great example of that. The lack of accountability, the lack of showed outcomes. Reporting that 130,000 provided homes for 130,000 people when only 6 actual homes were actually built. And that's a huge disparity. Outputs versus outcomes.
Mike, you had a point you wanted to make?
Just a quick thing on reaching the most vulnerable and when the network is down. So we reckon when we come in with radio, we have the generator, we have the studio, we have the transmitter, and to the listener, we distribute radios. So we would stockpile 1,000 radios in a community, in a country to begin. And when we distribute, we ask this question, who's most vulnerable, who doesn't have access to information, because we have to make some choices. We can't give radios to everybody, so we would generally run it through our local on-the-ground partner who can say who does have the greatest need and try to get radios in the hands of those who are most vulnerable.
I'm conscious of time. How are we for time, Rachel? I mean, lady here, maybe a quick question here.
My name is Stella. I'm from FilmAid. We're working with refugee camps in Kenya and, from time to time response in East Africa. So to a great degree, we've been successful in training members of the refugee community in using social media. And we also have a bulk SMS system, and we've seen great results in terms of members of the community giving feedback. And for us, taking or filtering that information and feeding it back to the people that they needed. However, at the end of last year, we had an incident where two communities, the refugee camp in Kenya is a closed community because of the encampment policy. So two communities basically fought, and because we've trained, a lot of young people on alternative media, they were very quick to, taking their phones, photos, and posting them online. What that did was actually a little bit negative because, every time I post and somebody, from his community saw, then, they take arms and revenge, and so it had a negative impact. So what I'm interested in is how you're dealing with that possible negative impact that is generated from social media. And for me, it interests me a lot because in Kenya, there's a lot of control. We can see that there's, the refugees are under watch. So, the more they communicate and the more they do these kinds of things, it has significant negative impact on them, as well as the actors of that, that are within that context.
Yeah, Philip, from your experience, what do you do when social media is aggravating the situation and it's beyond your control?
I think it depends on the degree and the magnitude. I think that now will come in terms of there needs to be ethics in terms of empowering the youth on the do's and don'ts. But now if it goes out of hand, there needs to be an authority to actually come in and say, because you cannot control what people are posting online. It's very, very hard to, because a conversation can take its own course. But it's yes, you have to intervene and you just stick to facts. Don't take sides or like. Yeah.
From our side, we have reason to believe that the information that the guys were giving were actually factual. They were true that, say you've been attacked. So it's a fact. There is a photo of you. It's true you've been attacked. So in terms of fact, they were facts. But what it means is that it fuels the further negative action. And, I imagine as well, even if you think about the Westgate attack, all these things were factual. But, every time you show this, then there was possible negative impact, or during the post-election violence. It just means that if, somebody from this community sees, then they respond by taking arms, and so it sort of has a continued negative impact.
Okay, to me, I think as authority, it's always good to be neutral. Like now, what you need, like now as an agency, you do posts which are just neutral. You don't take sides. Because I remember during the various attacks in Kenya, when you say this community shot this other side, it actually flared that. So to me, I think it would be good to share that information with the police or with the authorities. Then they can actually be the ones to actually say that this actually happened here and there. But in terms of controlling that information, it's very, very hard. Control that information, to me, it's having somebody with authority to actually come on board to actually say, because even as FilmAid, it's also tricky for them to get in that situation. I think it would be good to forward that information to the police and say, this is what we have received, this is what's happening now. It's upon the police not to actually step in and say, because I remember during the Garissa attack, there were quite graphic images of the students of the various communities. Yes. And they actually, the government stepped in and said, if you post any graphic photos, you'll be arrested. and actually that now calmed down. And even guys were being flagged for posting those alarming statements and everything. So I think at times it's good to inform the authorities, because as agencies at times you cannot take sides, because if you take sides you may also but it's quite a dicey kind of situation.
Okay, I'm just going to wrap things up here with a question to all of you, which I know Rachel wants some feedback on, which is whether you feel that the CDAC network can offer you more support in this area. And I just wondered if there's anyone who's got some ideas in the audience about what role they see as the CDAC network playing in terms of supporting you as you engage with innovative technology. I mean, maybe you don't have any views at all, but...
I think there's enough resources online and network of agencies that with a little bit of initiative, individual organisations can peer-to-peer to find solutions. I think CDAC is needed to engage at the political level. It needs to engage under the Reshape Aid World Humanitarian Summit and say, if we want to get serious about this now, this is what we need the system to do, donors, agencies, etc. So I think that political engagement beyond a network now has to take shape, and they need to become an advocate for this at the political and strategic level.
Any other views from the floor on that front, on that question?
It might be helpful to act as a bit of a broker and link, like as an agency, we'd be really willing to try some things, but we need to be linked in with somebody who wants to kind of test something out, and we can work together in a partnership. So it's just like putting us in contact.
That's a very good practical suggestion. Another proposal here?
As we've read from the Kenya Refugee Operation, is to continue the dialogue has already begun, but generally to be a communication agency, we are disadvantaged a lot because the resources are less and less, and all the time we are implementing one of the units here, and therefore, when it comes to prioritization, we would basically, come under food and shelter and da-da-da. So we basically, out of 50 agencies that are in Kenya, we'll be kind of number 50 or 49. And, we recognize that even them, they recognize the importance of communication, but basically it could be logical as well, that because they continually say that it does come after all these priority basic needs. So, and I think this is the discussion that has to come, because communication in our experience is what can prevent a lot of the related things. That it's true you can prioritize food and nutrition, but without people using all the things that they're given correctly, you can still have a negative impact. So I think it's sort of balancing resources and the importance of communication. So it's a discussion that we hope CDAC can continue to take forward.
Advocate more strongly on that.
The importance of communication.
Okay. Great. Well, look, let me take this opportunity to thank Justin, Philip, and Yazid, whose name I momentarily forgot there. Thank you very much for contributing to this panel. I think a round of applause is well deserved.